Well, today on the Spiritual Reality Podcast, we're going to take a look at what happened on Sunday at City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota during the worship service. If you've paid attention to the news at all this week, you have seen or heard that a group of protesters from what is called the Racial Justice Network stormed into a church, pretty much took over the service. And so we're going to take a look at what happened there. We're going to take a look at the arguments kind of on both sides. And as always, we're going to look at how the biblical principles relate to the issues. Thanks for joining me. Make sure you subscribe on to the podcast on YouTube. Let's get to it. Well, on Sunday, as many as a dozen or more activists took over the church service at City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And there are images of children in fear, of people just getting up and leaving because the protesters were screaming in people's faces, telling them what they think they should be doing as a Christian. They yelled slogans like "ICE out," "Justice for Renee Good," "Hands up, don't shoot," other things like that. The pastor who was speaking made it clear that they should not be there acting that way, and they didn't leave right away. As soon as they began to act this way, he said, "This is, what you're doing is wrong." One of the leaders said that in a TV interview the leaders of the protest said in a TV interview that they were invited to be there because the pastor at some point had made it very clear that everyone was welcome. Which, of course, is true for almost any church, but it doesn't mean that anyone is welcome to take over the service. It means anyone is welcome to come in to listen to the service or participate in the preset program, not interrupt it or co-opt it. One of the main reasons that the protesters chose this church is that the church has a pastor on staff who also works for ICE. They wanted to take this as an opportunity to accuse the pastor and the church of hypocrisy. Basically, you can't say that you're a Christian or a pastor and support deporting people in their eyes. I think that when people hear that a pastor is also an ICE agent, it hits them as a little weird. But this is really no different than if you had a pastor who works as a police officer. There's nothing wrong with a pastor being involved in enforcing the law. It keeps other people safe. It might create some awkward moments if you're a police officer and you have to enforce the law on somebody. You turn around as a pastor and then try to invite their family to church or share the gospel with their family, and they may say, "Well, I'm not going to listen to you. You arrested my son or my dad or my sister." So, I mean, it could create some awkward moments, but there's nothing wrong with the pastor being involved in enforcing the law. It keeps other people safe. It doesn't mean that he hates the people that he has to arrest who have broken the law. It's not in any way, if he's not discriminating in how he enforces the law, he's not doing anything wrong. Right now, ICE has been painted as some sort of Gestapo. Thanks, Tim Walz has literally said that. But they are just continuing to do the job that they did under every single president, except for maybe under Biden, where basically there was an intentional push to allow in as many unvetted people as possible, and almost no effort to remove those those who came here illegally, and especially even those who committed crimes. Not even a big push to remove them, even if they've committed other crimes. As believers, we need to support the concept of law and order. That doesn't mean that we don't feel for that hardworking family that has come here to try to make a better life that might get deported in the process. But we all have to recognize that if you go about things the wrong way, it might catch up with you, and it might turn into a very inconvenient situation for you. If you lie on your mortgage application, that can blow up in your face later. That'll be very sad for your very nice family. Might lose their home, or you might go to jail for fraud. But if you had gone about it the right way, even if it took longer, you would have been better off. If you open a business and you don't bother to get all the proper licensing, it'll be sad that all your hard work might be for nothing because it's all going to get closed down. But this is how things work. Even nice people sometimes choose not to follow the laws, and they end up facing the consequences for doing that. If we're fighting for them to not suffer the consequences, we are technically fighting for ignoring laws. And that is not a great way to run society. Listen to what Proverbs 28:4 says, 4 and 5. It says, "For those who forsake the law, praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive against them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely." It's interesting that these folks who don't want enforcement of the law are actually siding with the wicked, according to that verse. You may have seen the ICE agent that pulled up to some of the protesters, and he rolled his window down and he said, "Hey, we're here to arrest a child sex offender. And you guys are out here honking your horns to warn them. You guys are, that's who you guys are protecting. That's insane," the guy says. So their entire concept of justice is way off. And that's basically what that last verse says. Evil men don't understand justice. They pervert it. 1 Peter 2:13-17 says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." Cultures have to be based on laws that are enforced, because we all have a sin nature. Humans will push the limits as far as we possibly can. And without laws that are enforced, the safety and predictability that is needed for people to succeed in a culture will disappear. It's as simple as that. Some of the excuses for why these people felt like invading this church was okay. Have been offered up. And one of the first things that it is, hey, we have a First Amendment right. Don Lemon, who was also there, and he insists he did not collaborate ahead of time with this group. However, he lives in Florida. And so it's interesting that he was able to be there so quickly when he heard this news story going on at this church. He's not a local reporter. It's not like he just run over, from 5 minutes away. But while interviewing the pastor who was preaching that day, he says, well, there's a constitution and freedom of speech. That's what he appealed to for why this was happening inside this church. This is a common mantra on the left. And by the way, in Marxist revolutions, they like to stir up the common man to protest and use their freedom of speech until they gain total power, and then that freedom of speech goes out the window. And you already see that, right? You already see that. Like in the past, it felt like that folks on the left were talking constantly about, hey, let us speak. Let our point of view be heard. You have to let our point of view be heard. And guess what? Like all of a sudden, you get to the Biden administration and they come up with hey, maybe we'll start a department to put down misinformation. And a lot of the things that they pointed out as misinformation that needed to be put down turned out to actually be true. So yeah, do you want your government beginning to take over that kind of power? Really, conservatives are the real protectors of freedom of speech, because they don't want to take public speech away from people who disagree with them. You'll hear soldiers say, hey, I totally disagree with you, but I put my life on the line for you to have that opinion. However, when someone gets fired because they said something on social media, people crow. Oh, what about freedom of speech? Freedom of speech assures that you won't be arrested for what you say. But freedom of speech does not mean that your employer has to keep associating with you if you become a PR liability. You are free to say whatever you want, but you are not free from the consequences of saying it. Other people are free to react however they want to what you said as well. And freedom of speech also does not apply, as far as protesting, does not apply to private property. If you think the local bank did you wrong and you think they're dishonest, you can go and you can get a sign that says what your grievance is with them, and you can stand on the public sidewalk outside that bank. You're on public land, and you can yell as much as you want to about that. And you're not going to be arrested. You shouldn't be arrested for that. But if you go in the bank and start yelling about what you think about what they've done, and you bring a whole bunch of friends with you to protest inside the bank, guess what? They can ask you to leave. People think that just because a bank is a public place where people do public business, or a church is a place where everyone is invited, that they can invade those spaces and they can do what they want, but they can't. They are still privately owned facilities, and if they don't want you there doing what you're doing, they can ask you to stop doing what you're doing, or they can ask you to leave. Now, as I've already touched on, some justified this by saying that the pastor who works for ICE is being inconsistent in his faith and it needed to be called out. Now, the thing is, that seems irrelevant to whether or not this was the right way to do it. As I've already said, they could stand on the sidewalk, right? I don't think it's a problem that he works for ICE and also works for this church. It's an interesting combination in my mind. But this does not give them the right to invade and shut down a service like this on private property. They also claim that this was nonviolent and they weren't armed. However, they were right up in people's faces yelling at them. And one protester who felt that he was touched threatened the other person. He said, "Do it again, see what happens." Again, it doesn't matter. If you're nonviolent, it's nice. It's great that you didn't show up with weapons. I appreciate that. But what they did was still illegal, and it sets a new low bar for public discourse in our country. We are now making our points through intimidation and invading sacred spaces and coming on people's private property to do that. Don Lemon said the quiet part out loud when he was recording outside the church and watching members leave. He said, "I imagine it's uncomfortable and traumatic for the people here, but that's what protesting is about." They wanted to turn the Sunday morning service into a traumatic, intimidating experience on purpose. Now, let me say that when you watch these folks scream at Christians, that you should be dead. If you're a real Christian, you would be down at the ICE facility protesting. What you see is the left trying to take over the narrative of what being Christian means. And you see this a lot. The left really wants to kind of take this moral high ground and tell us what we should be caring about. And we should be caring about the same things that they're upset about. If we don't go all in on climate panic, we're not loving to the future generation. If we just ask a few simple questions about that and say, I don't know if I buy into all this. If we don't support a woman and her child until the day they die, we're just mean if we're against abortion. Which, of course, nobody does more than Christian organizations to support moms that choose life. That's a straw man argument. If we're not angry that people are being deported, then we don't care about our neighbors. They create these false dichotomies. And guess what? We can love our neighbors. We can care about our neighbors. We can be there for our neighbors. And, we don't even know if they're here legally, illegally. It doesn't make any difference to us, because if they're here, we're going to care for them. But if they've broken the law, they'll have to accept the consequences. It doesn't make sense for us to stand in the way of someone rightly facing consequences for their actions. Don Lemon went on a podcast and he defended his actions and actually doubled down and did it by making accusations about the people in the church. And here's what he said: "I think people who are, in religious groups like that, talking about this church, it's not the type of Christianity I practice," because he wants to call himself a Christian but not follow the Bible at all. But he said, "But I think that they're entitled, and that entitlement comes down to a supremacy, a white supremacy, and they think that this country was built for them. That it is a Christian country, when actually we left England because we wanted religious freedom." So he thinks that these people need to have their Sunday service taken over because he thinks that they are entitled white supremacists. That's unbelievable that he thinks that about these people. It's a huge leap of logic. First of all, just because one of the pastors is bivocational and happens to also work for ICE doesn't mean that anyone or everyone in that church actually supports immigration enforcement. I mean, that's the law. So I hope that if they're looking at it from a Christian biblical worldview, that they are for enforcing the law. But even if they did, that's not white supremacy to want to make sure that the people who come here have been properly vetted and will be positive contributors to our culture. That's not about race. right? It's about coming here legally. Many wonderful people from all over the world and all races come here legally and are excited to be here and excited to become Americans and excited to be a part of the American culture. It's also about protecting the way of life that we've all agreed to under the Constitution. Now, I understand we all didn't sit down and agree to the Constitution, but that's the American bargain. That's the hey, this is what we've all said, we're going to follow. It's the only thing defining our country that we can point to and we can say that's the standard that we operate by. Now, Lemon would probably consider, I'm putting words in his mouth, so, but I'm just saying from what I've learned about him, to me, it seems like he would consider protecting the Constitution as white supremacy. But practically, what would you replace it with that would be more fair? I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's inspired by God. But what would you replace it with that would be more fair? Awful lot of countries have tried to put other things in place that they thought were good, and it hasn't worked out. A lot of American ideas came from England, but one thing that you see right now is we have absolute freedom of speech, and they're arresting people for speaking freely. Ironically, these protesters and possibly Don Lemon may be prosecuted under the FACE Act, which we've all heard about because it has been used to put abortion clinic protesters in jail for long periods of time. But what people don't realize is in order to get that passed, they also had to include houses of worship. So the FACE Act also covers houses of worship, which is so interesting because you have Christian houses of worship and then you have the left's houses of worship. And both of them are covered under the FACE Act. But these protesters were not on a public sidewalk. They interfered with the service. They clearly intimidated worshipers by getting up in their faces, and in one case, one threatened them. So it will be interesting to see if they are actually prosecuted and convicted. We will see what comes out of all this. I think churches are going to have to expect more and more of this type of intimidation. The dismantling of churches is a major part of the left's Marxist agenda. No matter how much they want to lecture us on about, what they think we should believe, they know that their worldview is not biblical. And as believers, we don't just need to roll over and allow them to take over our churches. Like it's okay to say, no, I'm sorry, if you're going to do that, we'll be happy to talk with you. We'll come down on the sidewalk and talk with you. We'll bring you water bottles and snacks and we'll have a chat with you. But you're not coming in here and shutting down the service. But at the same time, we need to resist seeing them as our enemies. They are people who need Jesus. They are people that Jesus died for. They are under a very strong delusion. And we need to pray for them as Jesus tells us to do. We need to share the gospel with them. And maybe we can transform our culture with the power of the gospel by seeing people like that. You got to remember, the Apostle Paul was once the biggest protester of Christianity, and he became the biggest proponent. So that's all we've got for this week's episode. Remember, if you're not seeing it God's way, you're not living in reality. We'll see you next week.